listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. Australia is among the globe's leaders in a race that we do not want to be winning, having some of the most prolific rates of sexual violence against children and young people in the world.
Criminal psychologists, criminal psychiatrists who work in the prison system, they label sexual offenders in the prison system as compensatory offenders, meaning that those individuals commit sexual crime in an ongoing attempt to compensate for a lifelong perception of being inadequate.
My chat with a sexual crimes expert is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Tuesday the 13th of May.
Morning, Tara, and morning to you listening. Happy Tuesday. The new leader of the Liberal Party will be revealed today, with Melbourne's Tim Wilson ruling himself out of the race after narrowly winning back the seat of Goldstein in recent weeks. Taking to Facebook, Wilson announced he won't be gunning for the top job today, but says his hopes for the Liberal Party's future is it's one that unites rather than divides, builds rather than tears down, and leads Middle Australia.
And look, him standing down has meant that the contest is now down to Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor and Deputy Leader Susan Lee, who spent the weekend gathering numbers ahead of today's 10 a.m. ballot to select both the leader and deputy leader. And if Lee secures the top job, she would be the federal Liberal Party's first female leader in history and's considered the more moderate of choices between the two, with Taylor more conservative.
Meanwhile, the PM's new ministry will also be sworn in this morning at a ceremony before the Governor-General. There'll be some fresh faces on the new front bench after the axing of Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus and Industry Minister Ed Husic. Husic, the one that called the Deputy PM a factional assassin, has again given us some spice, lashing out against Labor's decision to dump the former Attorney-General.
Mark has been a big contributor. He should have been given dignity. There should have been some class extended to Mark, frankly. It was just gratuitous what happened with Mark, I thought.
And this is the blessing and curse of relegating someone to the backbench, where they are no longer tied with their hands behind their back and they can just unleash whenever they want. Thank you, Ed.
Unleash indeed. Now, meanwhile, there's still some counting going on, with projections now showing that there are just 3 seats left undecided in the House of Reps at the moment, with the Greens likely to retain at least 1 seat, the seat of Ryan in Brisbane. Meanwhile, the seat of Longman north of Brisbane and seats of Flinders and Calwell in Victoria are still being counted.
To the Middle East now, where the first hostage release since late February has taken place, with American-Israeli soldier Eden Alexander now free. The 21-year-old, who'd been held in Gaza since October 7, 2023 by Hamas, this morning handed over to Israeli forces, hopping on the phone almost immediately to his mum.
Oh my God, Eden! They just released a photo of you. You look unbelievable. Wow. You look beautiful. I love you so much.
That's them speaking for the first time in more than 580 days there.
Yeah, wow, some emotional audio coming out of that. And his mum was flown in from the US ahead of his release, alongside the Trump administration's hostage envoy, who had helped broker the deal, with Hamas saying that it agreed to his release as part of efforts to achieve a ceasefire. It's believed Alexander is the last living American-Israeli hostage held by Hamas, and like you mentioned, the first hostage released in more than 2 months, so since Israel resumed its bombardment of Gaza.
Staying overseas, but to the US now, where the trial of Sean Diddy Combs has begun in New York City. Combs is facing charges for racketeering, sex trafficking, and conspiracy and transportation to engage in prostitution.
The trial so far heard the start of opening arguments, with the rapper's defence team saying that while some of the evidence that'll be heard over the next few weeks may amount to domestic violence, they say it doesn't prove the federal charges that he's facing. Meanwhile, a federal government lawyer told the jury that this isn't a trial about a celebrity's private sex life. Rather, evidence will show that Combs's acts were coercive and criminal, at times making women have sex against their will, then threatening to release sex tapes from supposed freak-off parties to silence them.
The court also heard allegations that Combs and his inner circle helped facilitate sex crimes, arson and kidnapping on multiple occasions. His defence lawyer addressed the jury, telling them that those involved were willing participants and that while they might end up thinking Combs is, quote, mean or a jerk, it didn't make him guilty.
And the jury's also been warned to prepare to see some very disturbing footage of 2 alleged assaults involving Combs, his then girlfriend, and another woman being called Jane Doe. The rapper denies all charges.
Back home now and changing pace with some lighter news. The supermarket wars are heating up, and while there's no winners in war, Tara Cassidy, it looks like there's some silver lining in there for me and you. Woolies promising an average saving of $15 on a $150 weekly shop, so 10%, but also who's going to Woolies and walking away with a $150 price tag? Anyway, marking down almost 400 products, including bread, rice, bacon, some yogurts and soft drinks, and promising this is just the beginning, with the list to grow in the coming weeks and the lowered prices to hold into the future.
Yeah, and as for Coles, their promised savings are sitting around 21%, with just under 700 products to be discounted, from meat and seafood all the way to home care. And just like Woolies, the supermarket giant has promised that the list will grow in the near future, however, have called it a promotion rather than a long-term promise. And look, this obviously comes after the ACCC report in March into Woolies, Coles and Aldi, which found that they are among the most profitable in the world. And this is coming from the supermarket giants that hiked up the prices in the first place. So should we really be grateful? I don't know. Anyway, cheaper grocery bills, at least that's a plus.
And musical theatre fans unite, because we are getting a wicked live musical special featuring Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo. The live TV special will air in November ahead of the sequel's release on the 21st. Yes, there will be a second Wicked movie, with the film's director promising fans they will hear some songs from the popular Broadway musical that have never played on broadcast TV before. So you are in for more than just Defying Gravity and popular. Now, Tara Cassidy, I'm sure you can hear and you can see from the excitement on my face, this is great news. I am very excited and I welcome this. Yourself?
Yeah. No, I would be lying if I sat here and said I am the world's biggest musical fan. I once fell asleep during Cats. So I think we're learning a lot about each other in these morning shows. But no, very exciting news. I saw it all over my TikTok.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to take the reins, but I will be the first to admit that Wicked movie, 2 hours 40 is... That's a big ask. That is a really, really big ask. But yes, I will be tuning in on November. This is very exciting.
I promise I will lend it my eyeballs and we can chat about Wicked together, Chris. Now, that brings our headlines to a close for today. Next up is my deep dive, looking into the concerning rates of sexual violence here in Australia and what's contributing to it. And just a heads up, it does discuss themes of child abuse and sexual violence, which might be distressing for some. If that's not for you today, we hope you'll join us again later this afternoon. Almost 1 in every 3 girls has experienced sexual violence before the age of 18 in Australia, and 1 in 6 boys. A new study's found our rates are well above the global average. In fact, we're among the world's worst offenders. And experts say the issue is partly our Aussie culture. The behaviour's created, it's learned. Brent Sanders is a former police officer who spent decades studying sexual offenders and their behaviours, and now presents about sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in schools and unis across the country. Brent, thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing. This study paints a pretty grim picture of Australia and says that our rates of sexual violence against kids and young adults are some of the worst in the world. Why do you think that is?
Goodness, that's a great question, Tara, and I guess if we knew the answer, we could probably do more towards addressing it. As you rightly point out, Australia is recognised to be a country which has amongst the highest statistics of sexual crime of any surveyed country in the Western world, and that has sadly been quite consistent throughout the 3 decades that I've worked in this space. What are the reasons for it? Look, to be honest, there's a lot of contributing factors. When we look at different types of sexual crime too, we're looking at different types of offenders, perhaps different motivations. The area that I spend most of my time in is a little narrower. So the age group that I'm presenting to in that sort of 15 to 20, 21 age group, in that environment, that's the highest risk age for young women in Australia. That's not to say that there's not a risk at a younger age or an older age. Of course there is. But 15 to 21 is recognised as the high risk age for girls and women to be targeted for sexual crime. If we look at males, in that age group, they're quite low risk to be targeted. The high risk age for males is when they're a lot younger, primary school age. The profile of the offenders are quite different too when we look at those age demographics. Young boys at primary school, and again, this is not to say that girls can't be targeted for sexual crime at primary school age. Of course they can. But for males, their high risk age is when they're little, primary school. Most common profile of an offender would be an adult male in a position of care or control. So usually when we investigate child sexual crime, say against males, it's usually a male offender, so it's a male-to-male sexual crime. And usually, not always, there's a connection between offender and the victim of the crime whereby they're sadly family member, extended family, adult family friends, or adults in positions of care and control. When we move forward in those age groups to talk to the audiences that I present to, and I've put over 1 million students in that 15 to 21 age group through my talks, the risk to the males in those audiences of being targeted is quite low comparative to when they were at primary school. The risk to the young women is at the highest. It's that 15 to 21, that's at the highest. And that's where we hear figures from reputable studies coming in at sort of, 20%, 20 to 25%. Of young women in Australia aged 15 to 21 in that 6-year time frame will experience some form of sexual crime. If we extend those ages out and say, from 0 up to 18, of course those numbers get more and more sort of disturbing. In that 15 to 21 age group, young women targeted for sexual crime, the profile of the offender is quite different. It is usually, not exclusively, but it is usually going to be a young man of similar age, so same year group or a year group older at school, who the young woman would describe as someone she knew socially and she thought that she could trust. So again, that's quite different to the perhaps perceived view that these sexual crimes are usually committed by strangers and things. Strangers can commit sexual crime, but it's actually very, very rare, and it becomes rarer the older we get when we look at that demographic. So a lot of detail in there, but that can make it all a little bit confusing.
And there's also been some studies that have found that Australia is also among the highest consumers of child sexual abuse material globally. What leads to that kind of behaviour?
What we are seeing, and I just want to preface this too, is the one area of sexual crime with regard to stranger crimes that has increased dramatically is via sort of the internet and things such as that. And that's because we're starting from a zero base. When I was in the police in the 80s and 90s, there was no internet presence with regards to child pornography and things such as that. So it didn't happen because it wasn't around. It wasn't something that people could do. But what we've seen with the access to, the dark web and the access to pornography and things such as that, of course, we've seen a massive increase in that environment because we're starting from zero. I think the general consensus is that type of material doesn't turn somebody into a sex offender, but it's the type of material that is accessed by people who have a leaning towards that type of crime, and it feeds into that, and disturbingly now we have a greater prevalence of it.
Why is it so high in Australia compared to other crimes then?
Look, I don't know. There's so many different factors that contribute to this. In the Australian workplace, sexual harassment is still the number one most common form of inappropriate workplace conduct, of any form of conduct in the Australian workplace. Now, I'm not saying those who sexually harass within a work environment are by definition those that are sex offenders. What I'm saying is that We see this trend throughout Australian society. So I don't think these things are siloed. I think there's a connection between all of this.
And it looks as though it is a bit of a cultural issue because Australia's rate of sexual offending against girls is actually 47% higher than the global average, and then 14% higher for boys too. How do we combat these types of views if it is a cultural problem?
You know, you would find that New Zealand has similar statistics, and if you look at Australia and New Zealand, they are societies that, rightly or wrongly, place value, emphasis for young men on drinking, sport, all these types of things. And the overwhelming majority of young men that I've had the privilege of putting through my talks are decent young men who will not sort of cross these lines and do this type of thing. But it's those on the fringes who live in a society that they perhaps feel that they don't live up to the expectations that they perceive society has placed upon them. In that position, it will often be those people who will look for areas to sort of elevate that feeling of not being powerful, not being in control. And this is perhaps in the context of the time that we have in this discussion, it may come across as a simplistic view, but any society that places within certain elements of that society value on sort of the macho type of male type thing, for those that are on the fringe of that or feel that they fall below that, they sort of naturally try to play a bit of catch up. And one area that we see this happening is the profile of those who commit sexual offences. If you speak, I wrote a book on this, 20 odd years ago. If you speak to criminal psychologists, criminal psychiatrists who work in the prison system, they label sexual offenders in the prison system as compensatory offenders. That's how they approach them, meaning that those individuals commit sexual crime in an ongoing attempt to compensate for a lifelong perception of being inadequate. Yes? So if you have a person, and say a young man, who has a perception, be it real or otherwise, that he's inadequate, he will look for ways to try and elevate that for himself. Now, one avenue for that is to target those who you perceive as being vulnerable to make you feel more powerful. So when we look at the profile of serial sex offenders, they will always, always, always seek out a target that they believe will be submissive towards them so that they can feel a feeling of power and control. When we look at sexual crime committed within social environments, when some young men hear the word no, their response is, oh my goodness, I'm losing control here, I'm losing face, I need to override that, so I'm going to keep pushing through this. Now, none of this is justifying these actions. It's just explaining where this stuff comes from. Not a coincidence, Tara, Australia has amongst the highest statistics of male suicide in adolescent males of any surveyed country in the Western world. What leads a young adolescent male to take drastic steps like taking their own life? Well, there's connected things that we're talking about with sexual crime. So it's a complex web of ingredients, but recognising the issues, we can see them, but trying to address them and change the course of these statistics is a challenging one.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly we've heard before that this is going to take a multi-pronged approach, and the different agencies and government and society all kind of need to come together on this one if we really do want to tackle it. Now, you were talking just before about compensatory offending, which is quite interesting to me. Is that commonly behind prolific sexual offenders? What else can you tell me about that?
When you actually meet, study or profile serial sex offenders, I've not met one who meets the description or profile that is depicted through TV, Netflix, and everything else like that. I knew a guy personally who worked on the Ivan Milat case, and this detective, he'd been a detective a long time, he said, when you go into that interview room, there's a part of you that wants Ivan Milat to be sitting there like with horns and a long tail, like the devil type of thing. He said, you walk in there and here's this tiny, skinny little, quietly spoken bloke behind the desk who offers a limp sort of a handshake, can't look you in the eye, speaks so quietly you can hardly hear him. And he said it's just this reinforcement again that these individuals who commit these horrendous crimes that are often built up by the media and built up by TV and Netflix and everything else, they're never really like that. Yeah, they are so clearly weak and frightened and compensating for that weakness by going out and committing these crimes. Where this flows over into the area that I've done a lot of work in is when you speak to sort of young women, which have been my audience for 30 years, there's a very strong conditioning through society, through TV, through movies, that the safest thing to do against someone like him is to do nothing. There is not one serial sex offender who's ever been profiled, going back to Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler back in the mid-60s, who hasn't run away from targets who have stood up to them. And if you look at the failure rate, it is always, always, always attributable to the actions taken by the person that they target. And so what I say to young women is every study done, what they will all recommend is, against your typical unarmed stranger sex offender, best option, run. If you can run, yell, scream, draw attention to them. They'll never stick around. They're absolutely paranoid of getting caught, and they are totally unprepared for any reaction other than submission.
Yeah, wow. That's very interesting and certainly would go against, I think, what a number of women would think is the right thing to do in that particular scenario. So thank you so much for your insight, Brent, and for joining me on The Briefing today.
Thanks for having me, Tara.
That was sexual crimes expert Brent Sanders speaking with me there about what's leading to Australia's concerning rates of sexual violence. And if this EP's raised any issues for you, remember you can call 1-800-RESPECT. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.
Listener.